Now we're going to take a look at the 19th President of the United States, Rutherford B. Hayes. Again, our rubric is 5 criteria that we kind of have as a framework: growth, finances, international politics, war and security, and to leave the country better or worse. But I think with Hayes, you have to start with the beginning, and you have to have a discussion as to how much blame you put on him for what I would call the corrupt bargain of 1876. Hayes's election, Hayes versus Tilden, was probably the most corrupt election in American history. In fact, I don't think there's much debate about it. Because of the outcome of the Supreme Court decision in Cruikshanks, there was no federal authority to enforce law in the South against the Ku Klux Klan and the terrorist groups that were violently murdering anyone who's black who tried to vote or run for office or be involved in civil politics in any way, shape, or form. And in addition, a new state had been brought into the Union in Oregon that was formed around white supremacy. I did a whole video on this, the history of Oregon. You can watch that video. There was no path forward for black voters to have representation, and there was incredible violence to oppress them, to murder them, to assure that the ballot boxes were fraudulent. In some places, there were literally more votes cast than existed voters in the county, despite the black suppression. In the South, it was clearly corrupt. But by the numbers, Hayes got less votes. Now, in America, the number of votes is not the requiring factor, it's the electoral votes. So the fraudulent votes in the South, as far as the outcome and wins, Tilden got more votes. But by electoral, it was still in debate and discussion. There were many contested electoral votes. The electors in Oregon, it was down to one vote. So an elector, I believe it was in Oregon, they were trying to make him not eligible, claiming he had some federal connection. In Louisiana and Florida, there was just outright corruption. And so there was a lot of debate and discussion as to who would be president. And I don't think Hayes would have the power to just assert that he was president, and I don't know what would have happened if he tried. Because having an honest conversation about America is having an honest conversation that at this point, the people who had the power to enforce law, those who had the guns, did not believe in anything but manifest destiny. They did believe in white supremacy. They were willing to assert that power. And we'll kind of talk about this when we get into Hayes later as an example of how racist America was at this time. And I don't think there's any way to describe it. Hayes was nearly impeached at one point when he vetoed a law that was just saying you can't restrict how many Chinese immigrants can be in a passenger. Like, it was a 15 passenger law. It wasn't even like restricting. It wasn't anything around even actual immigration. It was just how many Chinese could be in a location at a time. Him trying to veto that almost led to his impeachment. This is how racist the legislature was. This is how racist the country was. So do I blame Hayes for that? I have to give him some blame. It was his presidency. And as I said, the whole thing of this entire series is looking at each one in context. What came before and what came after, and what they were walking into and what they did with their time. So perhaps there's a world where a different person can have a different outcome. I have to assume that. But am I going to throw Hayes deep under the bus like I would Andrew Johnson? I don't think I am. I think after Andrew Johnson failed to act in the first 3 years and allowed the Ku Klux Klan to form and reform, and the former Confederates to go back with their guns and their arms and amnesty and ability to run, to let them reform as paramilitary groups in the South. And then once the Supreme Court indicated there was nothing the federal government could do legally to restrict them, that protecting the citizens of states fell entirely to the state. I don't know what Hayes could have done. You can argue there may have been more things that Grant could have done, and I did in the last video. Although, again, noting I don't know what Grant could have done short of issuing the entire federal army reconvene to go back and refight the Civil War, which would not have been popular and would not likely have happened, and he likely would have led to him not being reelected or just been ignored generally. I don't know, but he failed to do it. And so, because he failed to do it, the South fell into Jim Crow for the next 80 years. I did a video on the Solid South. Feel free to watch that if you want a more detailed explanation. But that falls on his ledger because it happened on his watch. It also happened on Grant's watch, and it most definitely falls on Andrew Johnson's watch, which is why he's currently second from the bottom. But it is part of what occurred during his time, and that waste of an entire multiple generations and generations, 80 years of people over and over being repressed and forced into subjugation, and the South just being backwards as a result. That all falls on his ledger. So for growth, I believe all of that hindered the growth of the South. I believe all that hindered the growth of America. So that's not going to be a positive for him. In terms of finances, I look at Hayes' presidency as generally a better than average one. He did have a surplus, but he didn't waste that surplus. He used that surplus to create the Pensions Act. He was coming out of the Panic of 1873. He managed a lot of complicated discussions around coinage, around currency debates. Things could have gone very differently, and I think he did a good job navigating that. I'm not going to say his presidency was, full of wealth, but I do like that he did have a surplus, and he utilized that surplus to put things in place for the long term. I also like that he continued the professionalization of the civil service. A lot of people will talk about Grant having a really corrupt presidency, and I think that's unfair to Grant, and it's definitely unfair to Hayes to talk about the corruption during this time, because you have to compare it to what came before. You're going back to when Jackson started basically the spoils system, where he's basically giving away things for political favors, and Grant and Hayes are starting the reform process, and as part of the reform process, you're finding about a lot of corruption and grift, and people are being caught for it. Do you blame them for people who are being caught and say that their administration was corrupt, or do you say what was not caught before because we weren't even looking? So the Civil Service Acts, a lot of the reform there, I think was very positive. I think those are things that went on to create a more professional government. And again, the pension system, I think, is as an outstanding precursor for the Civil War veterans. I think that was something that was necessary. You can imagine how many people were disabled, how many people were, widowed coming out of that war. And, we're about 20 years out. Those impacts are still relevant, and I think that was very, very necessary, and I think it was the appropriate thing to do. With regards to international politics, I would say he's kind of middle of the road. There were some conflicts around the Panama Canal that kind of went to nothing. There were some issues with Mexican groups coming across the border to raid Texas. He sent the army down there to deal with it. I think it was the appropriate response. On Chinese immigration, I think I talked about this a little bit earlier with regards to the racism. I think he tried, but I think, again, the country wanted to be what it wanted to be. It did not. It wanted to be a white supremacist country. Just call it what it is. And so the idea of the Chinese being able to come in and take advantage of the gold rush, to work on the railroads, we were willing to have immigrants come in and do the work. We weren't willing to have them be part of our country, and that's just the reality of what was going on. So again, I would put him fairly neutral on international politics, but not in a negative. Nothing happened on his watch. No one burned down the Capitol. No wars were started. There were no major scandals, and that in and of itself should be something that you acknowledge, because it doesn't have to go that way. You can easily have many conflicts during a 4-year presidency. War and security, again, I would say similarly. There was the conflict around the Mexican border. He dealt with it. There were no major wars, but you did have the railroad strike. And I would say that's something that does hit it as a knock. The railroad strike of 1877 that led to riots all across the country, and led to Hayes, and I think this is something I do give him credit for, but he didn't control the riots. The Posse Comitatus Act, which basically said you can't bring out military troops to act as police force. I think this is a great thing that he should get credit for. Because I think we could have gone down a dark path if the federal government kept being the group that enforced as strike breakers and those type of things. I do think doing the Posse Comitatus Act and making that clear line and distinction between military and police was very necessary and very helpful, and something that has been, I was thinking about this today in regards to the Posse Comitatus Act being discussed when there were troops deployed to Los Angeles for the immigration, and the limits that were put upon them in their ability to act because of that act. That comes from Hayes. So I give him some credit for that, but I also need to acknowledge that the railroad strikes were mass riots across the country. They're also followed by the Chinese riots, anti-Chinese riots in San Francisco. There was a lot of unrest within the country during his time. It's also why, again, from the beginning, I'm kind of giving him a little more grace as to how the compromise of 1876 transpired, because I can imagine a world where the violence and anger that you saw during his presidency with the strikes and the riots against Chinese and the mass murders in some cases against Chinese immigrants would have exploded if it had become a full-on race war with the South. Not again. I perhaps another president could have gotten everyone to calm down and do things differently, but I don't know. It's wishes and fishes. We'd all eat well. Last one, did he leave the country better or worse? And this is always the most important one, and I can't say that he left the country better. Again, I'm not saying it's entirely his fault that he was the one who was on the watch when Jim Crow became codified and just solidified and irremovable. That falls to the Supreme Court and Cruikshanks. Cruikshanks is why, when I was discussing the Dred Scott decision before, I said I'm not sure 100% that Dred Scott's the worst or Cruikshanks the worst. They're pretty close. They're very, very close decisions. I still say Dred Scott's worst led to the Civil War, but Civil War versus 80 years of an entire race of people being repressed and set, yeah, tough call on that one. But I can't say that's entirely his fault, but it did happen on his watch. And because it happened on his watch, I'm not going to say he left the country better. I have to say he left the country significantly worse. So where does that put him on the chart? Where does that put him on the 1 to 10 scale? I mean, on the 1 to 19 scale we have right now. I went back and forth on this for a couple times. I'm going to put him, he's below Adams, both of them. I kind of am looking at this point going, there's at the top you have the Washington and Lincoln are the very two top. Then I think you have Jefferson and Polk pretty close together. Monroe, Grant, and Madison are flawed, but overall positives. Each of them has significant flaws that are knocks against them. More Grant and Madison than Monroe. And then you have the two Adams, who I think you can argue left the country worse than they found it. Even if they had good intentions, they weren't successful. And then Hayes has to fall somewhere below that. I'm going to put him at number 10, just above Zachary Taylor, and I tell you why. I think I'm putting him above Taylor because Taylor left behind Millard Fillmore. So I think Taylor's year was probably better, but he left behind Millard Fillmore. Even though he retired after 4 years, even though I like Hayes when I read about him, his presidency, I would say probably just in the average range, number 10.